One of Formula One's most vital components could be about to change for the first time in a decade and a half. Pirelli's set for serious opposition to its bid to continue as F1's controlled tyre supplier beyond 2024, as its predecessor Bridgestone is pushing to return. Tyres aren't always F1's sexiest subject, but whether the championship sticks or twists with its supplier could make or break the huge ongoing efforts to improve the quality of racing. Pirelli's status as the incumbent supplier is a blessing and a curse. Sticking with the known quantity is an appealing, low-fuss choice, but there are plenty in F1 who think it's responsible for the limitations of the current tyres. Pirelli's argument has always been that it's providing tyres to the specification demanded by F1, which requested greater tyre degradation in the early 2010s in a bid to improve the racing. And whereas Bridgestone and previous tyre suppliers were paid by the teams, the business model was changed for 2011 and Pirelli now pays F1 to be the supplier. That means it's operating within its own budget and spending on technology accordingly. Generally, Pirelli has got better at hitting the targets requested when those targets became clearer, but the feeling in the paddock is that it's never quite cracked how to get the tyres to work properly without being too temperature sensitive. The question is whether in the modern era of ultra-heavy and downforce-laden F1 cars, it's possible to have a tyre that physically degrades over a stint, as requested for racing purposes, without thermally degrading so aggressively that drivers can't push hard or follow others closely. That's been a key factor in limiting the success of the 2022 technical rules designed to make it easier for cars to follow and race wheel to wheel. There's a crucial distinction between degradation and thermal degradation. Degradation is just the natural reduction in tyre performance with mileage, usually through the mechanism of wear. Thermal degradation is when the core of the tyre becomes so saturated with heat it can no longer retain the ability to resist the loads placed upon it through elasticity. Why this is crucial is because what it imposes on the driver. If it's straightforward wear-dominated degradation, although the tyre is losing performance with mileage, it can still be driven more or less flat out. But if it's heat degradation, to prevent that getting into a runaway state, it needs to be driven a big chunk off the pace. Control tyres in the Pirelli era have always featured more thermal degradation, at most tracks but not all. There's still a skill involved in driving the tyre on the edge of retaining its performance on the balancing point just before thermal runaway, but that point is typically whole seconds slower than how fast the car could be driven, which undermines the efforts to get the cars to run closer and race harder. Pirelli has become associated with a heightened management style of racing, but the prospect of Bridgestone returning wouldn't necessarily mean F1 returns to flat-out races. When Bridgestone was last in F1, the cars were 200 kilos lighter, had around 60% less torque, and had substantially less downforce. This is likely to be the main limitation to whether F1 cars can truly ever be raced flat out again. But if it's possible to develop a tyre that can facilitate that, there has long been a lack of faith in the paddock that Pirelli would be able to produce it. Bridgestone seems to have the faith of a few more people. The prospect of a Bridgestone bid has been rumoured in the F1 paddock for months, and there have now been multiple reports that an official tender document has been lodged and had strong support from a number of drivers. A BBC report on Bridgestone's plan suggested drivers who are in favour of it feel its past F1 record plus the achievements of other tyre suppliers in different motorsport categories prove it should be possible to create F1 tyres that hit the performance and degradation targets without the problems Pirelli has encountered. Bridgestone first came into F1 in 1997 and began a tyre war with its previous sole supplier Goodyear. It only supplied midfield teams that year, but its products were strong enough at certain tracks to take the likes of Prost and Arrows close to race victories. McLaren switched to Bridgestone the following year and won the title with Mika Hakkinen in the first season of the grooved tyre rules. Bridgestone then had 2 years as sole supplier after Goodyear's exit before a fresh tyre war with Michelin from 2001 to 2006, during which Bridgestone dominated with Ferrari until Renault and Michelin's 2005-06 titles. Then Bridgestone had another spell as sole supplier before deciding to pull out at the end of 2010. Its extremely resilient tyres during the latter period were cited as a reason by some for the dull racing and predictable strategies of the time, prompting the push for greater degradation to create more variation in the Pirelli era. It's easy to look back at Bridgestone's products from 1997 to 2010 and assume it's a foregone conclusion that it's technically superior to Pirelli. But while Bridgestone is a remarkable company and would certainly produce at the very least very worthy F1 tyres, it would be returning to F1 on a very different basis. Bridgestone has never produced a spec tyre for F1 completely from scratch. Yes, it was the sole supplier again from 2007 to 2010, but this was technology developed in a tyre war carried over and evolved from there. Even though the slicks that came back for 2009 were obviously a different product, they were influenced by Bridgestone's pre-existing program. More importantly, that was very much not in an era of F1 wanting high-deg tyres. That request only came after Bridgestone's usually robust tyres unexpectedly fell apart at the 2010 Canadian Grand Prix, creating a chaotic and unpredictable race that became the blueprint for the Pirelli era. A modern Bridgestone F1 tyre would be developed very differently to specific targets and with far more constrained testing. So a different and hardly insignificant challenge, but this is Bridgestone, which doesn't do things by halves, so you can be absolutely confident its proposal will be compelling and extremely credible. It's positive for F1 that there are two credible tyre companies tendering for the supply deal, and who prevails will depend on the fine detail of their submissions. The decision is understood to come down to technical discussions with the FIA and commercial ones with F1 itself. As a result, the sole tyre supplier model doesn't necessarily lend itself to choosing the best candidate purely on the basis of who would produce the best tyre. That's not aimed at either Bridgestone or Pirelli in particular, simply a point that tyre manufacturer X will be chosen because it has a good technical capacity, puts in a lovely high-value commercial bid, and has a very friendly sustainability plan. If it offers less money and has a worse carbon footprint, then producing the best tyre, which is absolutely critical for F1, always has been and always will be, feels like it risks becoming a second or even third order priority. There's a feeling that F1 itself still looks favourably on Pirelli because of the other factors that go into being the sole tyre supplier, which is why Pirelli has never been hung out to dry by the championship. Criticism of Pirelli is only ever from teams and drivers, and as we've alluded to already, this has been a regular occurrence with issues raised over the durability and characteristics of the product. Pirelli is currently embroiled in an ongoing controversy over F1's plan to ban tyre warmers for 2024, with drivers adamant that blanketless Pirellis aren't going to be ready to be used safely. The plan to remove tyre warmers is being pushed primarily on environmental grounds due to the energy required to run the tyre heating blankets, but is on hold awaiting the outcome of further track testing and a team's vote in July after the final tests. Mercedes driver and Grand Prix Drivers Association director George Russell participated in the recent Pirelli tyre test at Barcelona that focused on development of the rubber and said F1's not in a position to go blanketless. His rationale was that while high track temperatures allowed relatively quick tyre warm-up at Barcelona, he's concerned about safety in cooler conditions. Based on his experience of the tyres in winter tests, Russell said crashes would be inevitable on outlaps in cooler weather and said he also feared for the safety of mechanics in the pit lane. These are factors that several other drivers have noticed as well, but Pirelli's F1 chief engineer Simone Berra described the Barcelona test as positive, and he argues that drivers will just have to adjust their approach to the first part of outlaps should the ban on tyre warmers go ahead. He's adamant that testing has shown no reason to be concerned about safety, either for those working in the pit lane or those on track. There is one more test scheduled at Silverstone in July before a possible vote that could lead to the ban on all forms of tyre warmer being introduced in 2024. Pirelli should have an answer by the summer, by which point we should also know who F1's tyre supply will be for 2025 and beyond. So in the coming weeks, Pirelli will discover not just what it's developing for 2024, but whether that will be for its last set of F1 tyres altogether, or if it has seen off Bridgestone's competition and will retain one of F1's underrated but most important roles.